The loneliest graves in the Old West were not the ones buried without names, but the ones buried without witnesses. The storm rolled across Black Hollow Valley like something alive, dragging curtains of snow through the pine trees and rattling the loose boards of Silas Reed's cabin hard enough to wake the dead. Wind pushed smoke sideways from the chimney. Ice clung to the fence posts in thick white layers. Somewhere beyond the hills, a horse cried out once, then vanished beneath the howl of the blizzard. Silas sat alone beside the fire with a tin cup warming his hands, staring at flames that barely fought back against the cold creeping through the logs. 12 winters alone had taught him one thing about the mountains. Nothing good ever knocked after midnight, especially not during a storm like this. He heard it anyway, a sound so faint he almost mistook it for the wind. 3 weak knocks against the cabin door, then silence. Silas didn't move at first. His rifle rested beside the chair. The old clock near the fireplace ticked slow and hollow in the darkness. Another knock came, softer this time. Desperate, Silas stood carefully, his boots groaning against the wooden floorboards, and reached for the lantern hanging by the door. The flame inside trembled as badly as the storm outside. "Ain't got food to spare," he muttered toward the door, though his voice carried no anger, only exhaustion. He unlatched the lock anyway. The wind burst inside immediately, sharp enough to steal breath from his lungs. Snow swirled through the doorway like white smoke. And there, collapsed against the porch rail beneath inches of fresh snow, lay a child. Small, motionless, wrapped in torn Apache blankets stiff with ice. Silas froze. For one long second, the storm itself seemed to disappear. The boy couldn't have been older than 10. Dark hair crusted with frost. Tiny fingers curled around a silver necklace hanging from his neck. His lips had turned pale from the cold. Silas looked toward the distant hills automatically, searching for movement. Riders. Tracks. Anything. But the blizzard had swallowed the entire valley whole. Whoever the boy belonged to, they were gone. Or dead. The old cowboy exhaled slowly through his nose. "Lord," he whispered under his breath. Every bad memory he owned seemed to crawl out of the firelight at once. Apache raids. Burned wagons. Graves half covered in dust. Men in town talking about savages like animals around whiskey tables. Silas had heard those stories his whole life. But none of those stories looked like this child shivering to death on his porch. The boy stirred suddenly. Barely. A tiny breath escaped his mouth like smoke in winter air. Alive. That changed everything. Silas bent down with a grunt, lifting the boy carefully into his arms. The child weighed almost nothing. Too light. The kind of lightness hunger creates. Snow melted against Silas's coat as he carried him inside, and kicked the cabin door shut against the screaming wind. The fire cracked loudly as he laid the boy beside the hearth. "Easy now," Silas murmured. "You ain't dying out there tonight." He pulled extra blankets from the corner of the room and wrapped them around the child, while heat slowly returned to the frozen cabin air. The boy's breathing came shallow and uneven. His face twisted faintly with dreams or fear or memories Silas couldn't see. Up close, the silver necklace caught the firelight. An eagle carved into worn metal. Apache markings etched around the edges. Old craftsmanship. Important craftsmanship. Silas reached toward it, then stopped himself. Some things carried weight a man could feel without touching. He moved toward the stove instead, pouring the last of his stew into a pot to warm. Outside, the storm only grew worse. Snow hammered the roof. Tree branches groaned in the darkness beyond the windows. Somewhere near the barn, one of the horses stomped nervously against frozen ground. Silas glanced back toward the child again. "You picked one hell of a night to get lost, kid." The boy's eyes opened suddenly. Dark eyes, sharp despite the fever burning behind them. For one brief moment fear flashed across the child's face so fiercely it made Silas step back. The boy tried to sit up too quickly, panic flooding every movement. "Easy," Silas said quietly, raising his hands. "You're safe here." The child stared at him. Without blinking, snow melted slowly from strands of black hair onto the blanket. His breathing shook hard. Then his gaze drifted toward the fire, toward the stew simmering on the stove, and finally toward the rifle leaning beside the wall. Silas saw the exact instant the boy decided whether to run or trust him. It happened silently, the way storms change direction in the mountains. The child relaxed just enough to stop fighting. "Good," Silas whispered. That's good. He handed over the steaming bowl carefully. Small frozen hands trembled as the boy accepted it. For a while neither of them spoke. Only wind and fire filled the cabin. Then the child finally looked up and whispered one word in broken English. Why? Silas frowned slightly. Why what? The boy swallowed hard before speaking again. Why help me? The question hung heavy in the room. Silas looked toward the fire instead of answering immediately. Flames reflected in his tired gray eyes. Because winter don't care what blood a man's born with, he said at last. And because no child ought to freeze alone. Outside, somewhere far beyond the storm and darkness, something moved across the valley floor. Too distant to hear yet. Too many to count. And neither the cowboy nor the child knew that before sunrise, the mountains themselves would begin riding toward Black Hollow Cabin. The mountains grew quiet near dawn, and that was what frightened Silas Reed the most. Storms always made noise. Wind screamed through canyon walls. Ice cracked in the trees. Snow hissed against cabin windows like dry sand across stone. But sometime after midnight, all of it faded into a silence so complete it felt unnatural. Silas sat awake beside the fire with his rifle resting across his knees, listening to that silence press against the cabin from every direction. The Apache boy slept beneath layers of wool blankets near the hearth, though sleep looked uneasy on him. Every few minutes his breathing quickened like he was running through dreams too terrible to escape. Firelight flickered across the child's face, softening the sharp lines of fear he carried even while unconscious. Silas studied him quietly. There was something strange about the boy. Not dangerous, just unfamiliar in a way the old cowboy could not explain. Most children breathed loudly in sleep, shifted around, mumbled nonsense. This one barely moved at all, like he had learned long ago that making noise could get a person killed. The silver necklace still hung around the child's neck, reflecting orange firelight whenever the flames rose high enough. Silas had spent years around ranch hands, drifters, traders, and soldiers moving through Black Hollow Valley. He recognized expensive things when he saw them. That necklace was not ordinary tribal jewelry. Somebody important had once held that silver in their hands. Outside, the horses stomped nervously again. Silas looked toward the frost-covered window beside the door. Easy out there, he muttered. Ain't nothing coming through this weather. But even as he said the words, he felt the lies settle heavy in his chest. The mountains had changed. Men who lived alone learned to feel those changes the same way wolves smelled rain. Something was moving out there beyond the storm. Something large. The boy stirred suddenly beneath the blankets. His eyes snapped open hard and fast, filled with panic before they found the cabin walls again. His breathing came sharp. Hey, Silas said quietly. You are all right. The child looked around like he expected strangers to burst from the shadows. When he finally recognized the fire and the old cowboy sitting nearby, his shoulders relaxed slightly. Bad dream? Silas asked. The boy hesitated before nodding once. Dreams follow mountains, he whispered. His English sounded stronger now, though every word still carried exhaustion beneath it. Silas leaned back slowly in the chair. Mountains got too much time on their hands. The boy almost smiled at that. Almost. It vanished quickly. What is your name, kid? The child looked toward the flames for several seconds before answering. Nantan. Silas frowned faintly. That your full name? The boy gave a tiny shake of his head. Only part white men can say. Silas snorted softly through his nose. Fair enough. The fire cracked loudly between them. Outside, snow slid from the cabin roof in heavy sheets. Nantan held the steaming tin cup Silas had given him earlier with both hands now, absorbing warmth like somebody who had gone too long without it. You live here alone? The boy asked quietly. For 12 years. Why? Silas stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. Because people talk too much. Nantan tilted his head slightly, waiting for more. But Silas did not continue. Some memories were easier carried in silence. The cabin itself told enough story already. One wooden chair across from the table never used. Dust-covered piano in the corner untouched for years. A faded blue shawl hanging beside the fireplace, like somebody might still come back for it someday. Nantan noticed all of it. Children always did. You had family once, he said softly. Silas looked at him sharply. How do you know that? The boy nodded toward the shawl. People do not keep ghosts unless they love them. For the first time in years, Silas Reed did not know what to say. Wind scraped against the cabin walls. The old cowboy looked away from the child and toward the dark window instead. My wife liked that shawl, he admitted quietly. Used to wear it every winter. Nantan remained silent. Had a little girl too. Silas continued before he could stop himself. She used to sit right there near the fire and complain every time snow came through the roof. A faint smile touched his face. Painful. Brief. Gone almost instantly. What happened to them? The boy asked. Silas swallowed once. Hard. Fever. The word dropped heavy into the room. Simple. Final. The kind of word the frontier buried thousands beneath. Nantan lowered his eyes respectfully. I am sorry. Silas nodded once, but said nothing. The fire popped again. Outside, were no longer making nervous sounds. They had gone completely still. What is wrong? Nantan whispered from behind him. Silas narrowed his eyes toward the distant hills. That is what I am trying to figure out. Then he saw it. A light. Far away near the ridge line beyond the frozen creek. Tiny at first. Barely visible through the storm. Then another appeared beside it. Then another. Not lanterns. Torches. Moving slowly through the snow. Silas felt cold settle deep into his bones despite the fire roaring behind him. Nantan stepped closer to the window. The moment he saw the lights, the color drained from his face completely. No, the boy whispered. No, they found me. More lights emerged through the storm. 10, 20, spreading silently across the ridge like stars appearing one by one in the night sky. Silas tightened his grip on the rifle. Who found you, kid? Nantan stared toward the valley with fear burning in his dark eyes. Then he whispered 5 words that made the cabin suddenly feel very small. The mountain riders are here. The torches kept coming. One after another they appeared through the storm until the ridgeline above Black Hollow Valley looked like a line of burning stars drifting across the snow. Silas Reed counted at least 30 before he stopped trying. The strange part was not the number of riders. It was the silence. No shouting. No war cries. No drunken voices carried by the wind. Only the soft thud of horses moving through deep snow somewhere beyond the darkness. Nantan stood frozen beside the cabin window, his small fingers gripping the blanket wrapped around his shoulders so tightly his knuckles turned pale. Firelight trembled across his face. Fear sat inside the boy differently than it did in grown men. Adults usually hid fear behind anger or pride. Children did not know how. Do they know you are here? Silas asked quietly without taking his eyes off the ridge. Nantan swallowed hard before answering. They always know. More torches appeared farther down the valley now. Not random. Organized. Moving slowly into position like wolves surrounding a wounded animal. Silas had seen cavalry formations before during the border wars years ago. This movement felt similar. Careful. Patient. Controlled. Whoever these riders were, they were not reckless men charging blindly through snow. They knew exactly where they were going. The old cowboy moved toward the front door and lifted the lantern higher. Frost had already formed along the inside edges of the windows. The storm outside seemed thinner now, weakening just enough for shapes to emerge from the darkness beyond the cabin. 1. The rider looked first at Silas, then past him toward the child standing near the fire. The moment Nantan stepped into view, the man closed his eyes briefly like a burden had finally lifted from his shoulders. Nantan, he said softly. The boy's breathing caught instantly. Uncle. Silas frowned slightly. Uncle. That changed things. The rider stepped forward slowly but stopped before crossing the doorway. Respectful. Controlled. Snow settled across his fur cloak in thick white layers. You brought great fear to the mountains, little wolf, the man said quietly to the boy. Nantan lowered his head in shame. I am sorry. The rider nodded once before turning his attention back toward Silas Reed. For several seconds neither man spoke. Wind moved softly through the valley behind them. Torches flickered in the distance like restless spirits beneath the storm clouds. Then the rider's gaze shifted toward the silver necklace hanging around the child's neck. His expression changed almost invisibly. Something deeper than relief passed through his face. Something closer to gratitude. You protected him, the rider said. Silas shrugged faintly. I kept him warm. Nothing more. The Apache man studied him carefully. Many men would not have. The old cowboy leaned against the doorway slightly, rifle still resting low in his hand. Well, winter makes corpses out of enough people already. A faint smile touched the rider's weathered face for the first time. Small. Brief. Real. My name is Chayton. Silas nodded once. Silas Reed. Chayton glanced back toward the valley where hundreds of silent riders still waited beneath snow and darkness. The mountains were preparing for sorrow tonight, he said quietly. Instead, they found mercy. Silas did not know how to answer that. He looked toward the endless line of torches stretching across Black Hollow Valley. There had to be over 200 riders now, maybe more hidden farther back beyond the ridge. Enough men to swallow every ranch and settlement within 50 miles if they chose to. Yet none of them moved aggressively. None crossed the frozen creek below the cabin. They simply waited, watching, patient as stone. Nantan stepped closer to the doorway. Will they leave now? Chayton looked down at the boy carefully. Not yet. The child's face tightened again. Why? Chayton's eyes slowly lifted toward Silas Reed once more. Because the chief himself rides before dawn. The wind seemed colder after those words. Even the horses outside shifted uneasily. Silas looked toward the distant ridgeline, where new torchlights still emerged through falling snow one by one. More riders. More shadows. More silent eyes watching the cabin from the dark mountains. The old cowboy suddenly realized something that made his stomach tighten hard. This was not a search party. This was an entire nation arriving at his doorstep. And somewhere beyond the storm, the man leading them had not come merely to reclaim the boy. He had come for Silas Reed too. If you are still listening this far into the story, leave a like and tell me where you are watching from tonight, because Black Hollow Valley is only beginning to reveal its secrets. The rest of the night passed without sleep. Black Hollow Valley remained buried beneath snow and silence while hundreds of torchlights glowed across the ridges like watchful eyes in the dark. Silas Reed kept the cabin door barred after Chayton stepped back into the storm, but the old cowboy understood something now that made rest impossible. Those riders were not waiting for sunrise because they feared him. They were waiting because their leader had not arrived yet. Fire crackled low inside the cabin as dawn slowly crept closer beyond the frosted windows. Nantan sat near the hearth wrapped tightly in blankets while shadows danced across the walls around him. The boy had barely spoken since Chayton left. Every few minutes he glanced toward the window, as though expecting something terrible to emerge from the snow at any moment. Silas poured coffee into a dented tin cup and stared toward the valley. You planning on telling me why half the mountains showed up for one skinny kid? Nantan lowered his eyes toward the fire. Because I ran. Children run away every day. Not like this. The boy's voice carried guilt deeper than fear now. Silas sat down slowly across from him. The cabin smelled of smoke, old leather, and melting snow. Start talking, son. Nantan hesitated for several seconds before finally touching the silver necklace hanging around his neck. This belonged to my grandfather. Silas nodded once. I figured it meant something. Only one person in our tribe wears this necklace. The boy swallowed hard. The blood of the chief. The old cowboy leaned back slightly in his chair. There it was. The truth had finally stepped into the room. He looked at the child differently now, not because the boy mattered more suddenly, but because everything around him made sense at last. The riders, the silence, the patience. Men did not cross frozen mountains during a blizzard for ordinary reasons. You are the chief's grandson, Silas said quietly. Nantan nodded once. My mother was his oldest daughter. The fire popped sharply between them. Outside, faint shapes still moved across the valley ridge beyond the cabin. Horses, watchers, shadows wrapped in snow. Silas rubbed one rough hand across his jaw slowly. So why run away from people willing to freeze half to death trying to find you? Nantan stared into the flames. Because they want me to become something I do not want to be. The old cowboy frowned faintly. Meaning, the next chief. Silence settled heavily across the cabin after those words. Wind brushed softly against the roof now, weaker than before. Dawn approached slowly through pale gray skies beyond the frost-covered windows. Silas looked at the boy for a long moment. He suddenly seemed older than 10. Not in size. In weight. Like somebody had placed an entire nation across his shoulders long before he was strong enough to carry it. You are just a kid, Silas muttered. That is what I told them. Nantan's voice almost broke then. Almost. But my grandfather says the mountains choose men early. Silas snorted quietly into his coffee cup. Mountains make poor decisions sometimes. For the first time since arriving at the cabin, the boy laughed softly. Small, brief, real. The sound surprised both of them. Then hoofbeats echoed faintly across the frozen valley outside. Slow, heavy, different from before. Not many riders this time. Just one. Silas stood immediately and moved toward the window. Snow still drifted through the air in thin white sheets beneath the pale morning sky. The torchlights along the ridge had stopped moving completely now. Hundreds of mounted figures remained perfectly still in the distance like carved shadows watching the cabin below. But one rider had separated from the others. He moved down the slope alone. Large black horse, fur cloak trailing behind him in the wind. Even from nearly 200 yards away, Silas could feel the presence of the man approaching. Nanton stood beside him at the window now. Fear and relief battled each other inside the child's eyes. "That is him," the boy whispered. Silas tightened his jaw slightly. "Your grandfather." Nanton nodded. The rider continued forward slowly until he reached the frozen creek near the cabin. Then he stopped. Snow drifted softly around horse and rider alike, while dawn light spread pale silver across the valley. The man sat tall in the saddle despite his age. Long gray braids rested against heavy buffalo fur. Feathers moved gently above his shoulders in the wind. But his eyes were what held Silas still. Calm eyes. Eyes that had buried friends, buried enemies, buried sons, and somehow remained standing afterward. The chief did not call out, did not threaten, did not demand. He simply waited there beside the frozen creek with the patience of old stone. Nanton suddenly moved toward the cabin door. "I should go." Silas glanced at him sharply. "You sure about that?" The boy stopped with one hand resting on the latch. "No, honest answer." Silas respected that. Outside, the chief remained motionless beneath falling snow. Behind him, the entire valley watched in silence. "He will not force you," Silas said quietly. Nanton looked down at the floorboards. "That is worse." "How?" "Because if he gives me the choice and I still leave," the boy swallowed hard, "then I become the reason my people lose hope." Silas looked toward the old chief waiting beyond the frozen creek. For a moment, he saw something unexpected there beneath all the quiet strength. Exhaustion. The kind only leaders carried. The kind built from years of watching others depend on you for answers you did not always have. The old cowboy exhaled slowly. "Families got a way of handing us burdens whether we ask for them or not." Nanton stared at him. "Did your father give you one too?" Silas looked toward the faded blue shawl hanging near the fireplace. "Every man inherits something." The boy nodded slowly like he understood more than children should. Then another sound drifted faintly through the morning air. Bells. Wagon bells. Silas frowned immediately and stepped toward the window again. Far across the southern trail beyond the ridge, several wagons were approaching Black Hollow Valley through the snow. Town wagons. And suddenly the old cowboy realized the people of Black Hollow had seen the Apache riders too. The wagons rolled slowly through the snow like nervous animals entering a predator's den. Silas Reed counted 4 of them crossing the southern trail beneath weak morning light, their iron wheels cutting deep grooves into the frozen ground. Smoke rose from the horses with every breath they took. The people inside Black Hollow had finally seen the riders covering the valley ridges, and fear moved faster through mountain towns than wildfire through dry grass. Nanton stood beside the window in complete silence, watching the wagons approach the cabin. The chief remained motionless beside the frozen creek below, waiting with the patience of winter itself. Hundreds of Apache riders still lined the hills beyond him without speaking, without moving, without giving the frightened town any clue what they intended to do next. That silence had become more terrifying than shouting ever could have been. "Your people should leave," Nanton whispered suddenly. Silas glanced toward him. "My people." The boy nodded toward the distant wagons. "White towns become dangerous when they are afraid." The old cowboy gave a dry snort. "That might be the smartest thing anybody has said in this valley in 20 years. The first wagon reached the edge of Silas's property near the split fence line. Men climbed down quickly, rifles hanging low near their coats. None of them looked brave. Brave men moved with calm. These men moved with panic hidden beneath forced confidence. Silas recognized every face immediately. Sheriff Boone Talbert stepped forward first, his thick wool coat dusted white with snow. Behind him came Walter Grin, owner of the general store, and old preacher Eli Dawson with frost covering his gray beard. 2 younger ranch hands stood farther back near the wagons, staring wide-eyed toward the Apache riders covering the ridges above. "Silas," Sheriff Talbot shouted from the fence line. You alive up there? Silas opened the cabin door slowly, but did not step outside yet. Cold air flooded into the room. Depends who is asking. The sheriff forced out a nervous laugh that died almost immediately. His eyes kept drifting toward the valley behind Silas. Mind explaining why there are 200 Apache riders surrounding Black Hollow this morning? Closer to 300 now, Silas replied calmly. That did not help the sheriff's face at all. Walter Grin removed his hat and wiped sweat from his forehead despite the freezing air. Dear Lord. Nanton stayed hidden near the fireplace while the men spoke, but the moment Sheriff Talbot spotted the edge of Apache blankets inside the cabin, his expression changed instantly. You got one of them in there? Silence fell hard. Even the wind seemed to pause. Silas rested one hand against the doorframe. He is a child. He is Apache. Walter snapped quickly. That is the same thing right now. Silas's eyes hardened slightly. No, it is not. Sheriff Talbot stepped forward before the tension could worsen. Easy now. Everybody just stay calm. But calm had already left Black Hollow Valley hours ago. The sheriff glanced nervously toward the old chief waiting beside the frozen creek below the cabin. Silas, you know who that is out there? I got an idea. That is Chief Essen. Even the preacher lowered his eyes slightly after hearing the name spoken aloud. The old Apache leader carried stories all across the frontier. Stories of winter raids, impossible negotiations, and tribes surviving where soldiers froze to death trying to follow them through the mountains. Men feared him because he understood patience better than anger. Word is he united half the northern tribes after the famine winter, Walter muttered quietly. People say whole forts backed away rather than fight him. Silas looked toward the old chief, standing silently beneath drifting snow. Strange thing was, Essen did not look frightening to him. Tired maybe, heavy with years, but not cruel. He has not threatened anybody, Silas said calmly. Walter stared at him like he had gone insane. 300 armed riders sitting above town sounds like a threat to me. Then maybe ask yourself why they are sitting instead of charging. Nobody answered that. Because nobody wanted to. Nanton slowly stepped closer to the doorway then, clutching the silver necklace tightly in one hand. The moment Sheriff Talbot saw the boy clearly, confusion crossed his face. That him? Silas nodded once. The sheriff studied the child for several long seconds before looking back toward Chief Essen below the creek. Then something shifted behind the lawman's eyes. Recognition. Sweet Lord, he whispered. That necklace. Walter frowned. What about it? The sheriff swallowed hard. I saw that symbol once when I escorted army officers through Fort Avery years ago. His voice lowered carefully. That necklace belongs to the bloodline of Apache chiefs. Silence returned heavier than before. Even Walter stopped talking after that. Nanton lowered his gaze toward the snow-covered floorboards. I did not mean to bring danger here, he whispered quietly. Preacher Dawson looked at the boy for the first time without fear in his face. Only sadness. Son, entire valleys have started wars over less. Outside, a strong gust of wind swept through the mountains, carrying snow across the frozen creek in long white spirals. Chief Essen finally moved for the first time in nearly an hour. Slowly, the old Apache leader raised one hand toward the cabin. Not a threat, not a signal to attack, just a simple open hand lifted toward the morning sky. Every rider along the ridges instantly lowered their torches together. 300 flames vanished at once. The valley darkened into silence again. Sheriff Talbot's face drained pale. How in God's name? Walter took a nervous step backward toward the wagons. They moved like one man. Silas watched Chief Essen carefully. The old leader still had not crossed the frozen creek, had not demanded the boy, had not raised a weapon, and somehow that restraint carried more weight than violence ever could. Then Nanton whispered something so softly only Silas heard it. He is waiting for me to choose. The old cowboy looked down at the child beside him. Small shoulders, tired eyes, a boy carrying the expectations of mountains far older than himself. Outside, Black Hollow Valley waited in frozen silence while 300 riders watched a child decide the future of his own life. Morning finally reached Black Hollow Valley, but the sunlight brought no warmth with it. Pale gray light spilled across the snow-covered ridges where hundreds of Apache riders still waited in silence above the town like shadows carved into the mountains themselves. Smoke rose slowly from cabin chimneys below as frightened families locked doors, covered windows, and whispered prayers over cold breakfast tables. Nobody in Black Hollow went to work that morning. Nobody opened shops. Even the church bell remained silent beneath layers of frost because fear had settled over the valley heavier than the storm itself. Inside Silas Reed's cabin, the fire burned low while tension pressed against the walls hard enough to choke the air from the room. Sheriff Boone Talbot stood near the doorway watching the riders through the window with restless eyes. Walter Grin paced near the table wiping his hands against his coat every few seconds. Preacher Dawson sat quietly beside the stove with his hat resting across his knees like a man waiting for judgment. And through all of it, Chief Essen remained beside the frozen creek without moving. The old Apache leader had not eaten, had not rested, had not spoken another word since dawn. He simply waited for his grandson to decide whether to return. "This cannot continue," Walter muttered suddenly. 300 armed riders sitting outside town is not peace. Silas leaned back against the wall near the fireplace. "Funny thing about peace," he said calmly. "Most people only recognize it when guns start firing." Walter glared toward him. "You know exactly what I mean." "Do I?" The store owner opened his mouth again, but stopped himself. Because deep down he knew Silas was right. Not one window had been broken. Not one threat shouted. Not one horse pushed beyond the frozen creek. The Apache riders had shown more discipline in 6 hours than most towns showed after 2 glasses of whiskey. Nanton sat quietly near the fire listening to the adults argue around him like he no longer belonged to childhood at all. His silver necklace rested against the blanket covering his shoulders while dawn light flickered softly across the worn eagle carving. Silas noticed the boy staring toward the door every few minutes now. Not fearful anymore. Thoughtful. Like he was slowly realizing that no matter what choice he made next, life had already changed forever. "What happens if you refuse to go back?" Silas asked quietly. The cabin fell silent immediately. Nanton looked down at the floorboards. "My grandfather will leave." Walter laughed nervously. "You expect us to believe that?" Nanton raised his eyes slowly. "He does not force his blood to stay." Sheriff Talbot frowned. "Then why bring all these riders?" The boy hesitated. "Because the mountains are dangerous when a chief's family disappears." Nobody argued with that. Outside, wind moved softly through the valley carrying loose snow across frozen fences and abandoned wagon trails. Somewhere in the distance a horse snorted sharply before silence swallowed the sound again. Then Nanton looked directly at Silas for the first time since morning. "But if I stay here," he swallowed hard, "others will believe I abandoned my people." Silas nodded once. "And that matters. More than what I want." The old cowboy understood those words better than the boy realized. Sometimes duty arrived long before a person felt ready for it. Sometimes life handed men responsibilities heavy enough to bend their backs for years. Silas had once tried outrunning his own burdens too. It had only left him alone in the mountains talking to ghosts beside a fireplace every winter. Preacher Dawson suddenly stood from his chair and walked slowly toward the window overlooking the frozen creek. He studied Chief Essen carefully for several long seconds before speaking. "I met a soldier once who spent time near Apache territory during the war years," the preacher said softly. "He told me something I never forgot." Walter sighed impatiently. "Now is not the time for stories." "It is exactly the time for stories," Dawson replied quietly. The old preacher kept his eyes on the Apache chief outside. "The soldier said the strongest leaders are not the ones men fear most." He paused. "They are the ones men willingly freeze beside." Silence settled over the cabin after that, because every person in the room understood the truth buried inside those words. 300 riders had crossed mountain storms not because Chief Essen demanded it. They came because loyalty carried them there willingly. Nanton lowered his eyes again. The burden on his shoulders suddenly looked heavier than ever. Then movement appeared outside near the edge of town. A young ranch hand came galloping through the snow toward the cabin, waving one arm frantically. His horse nearly slipped crossing the frozen road below the hill. Sheriff Talbot stepped outside quickly while the others watched through the doorway. Cold wind rushed inside immediately. "Sheriff," the ranch hand shouted breathlessly. "More riders coming from the North Ridge." Walter's face turned pale instantly. "More?" The young man nodded hard. "At least another 100. Panic moved through the cabin like wildfire. Walter grabbed his hat immediately. "That is it. We need to get families out of town now." But Sheriff Talbot did not move. He stared toward the northern ridges for several long seconds before slowly lowering his shoulders. "No," he said quietly. Walter blinked. "What?" The sheriff looked back toward the cabin with strange calm settling into his face. "They are carrying food." Everyone froze. The ranch hand nodded quickly. "Blankets too. Pack horses loaded heavy." Silence returned again. Outside, the new riders moved carefully down the northern ridge, carrying supplies through the snow toward the valley camp below. No rifles raised. No threats spoken. Just men preparing to survive. The cold together. Silas looked toward Nantan beside the fire. The boy's eyes shimmered faintly in the firelight now. "Your grandfather expected a long wait," the old cowboy said softly. Nantan nodded once. "He knew I was afraid." Outside, Chief Essen finally lifted his face toward the weak winter sun breaking through clouds above Black Hollow Valley. Snow sparkled across the ridges around him, while hundreds of silent riders waited patiently behind their leader. And for the first time since the storm began, Silas Reed realized something that unsettled him more than fear ever could. The Apache Chief was not trying to take anything from the valley. He was protecting the boy's right to choose freely. And somehow that quiet act of respect carried more power than any army marching through the mountains. Thank you for staying with the story this far through the cold winds of Black Hollow Valley. By late afternoon, the storm had finally loosened its grip on Black Hollow Valley, but nobody felt relief. The snow still covered the mountains in thick white silence while smoke drifted slowly from the Apache camp, spreading across the northern ridge. Hundreds of horses stood tied near pine trees below rows of canvas shelters that had appeared almost magically within a few hours. Fires burned low against the cold. Men moved quietly between them carrying blankets, water, and supplies without shouting once. From the town below, people watched nervously through cracked windows, as if expecting the valley itself to split open. Silas Reed stood outside his cabin with both hands resting on the top rail of the porch, staring toward the distant camp while the last light of day faded across the snow. Nantan sat nearby on an old wooden crate wrapped in the blue wool coat Silas had given him that morning. The boy looked smaller outside beneath the enormous sky and endless mountains around them. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The silence between them had become comfortable now, like the quiet shared by people who understood loneliness too well to waste words carelessly. Then Nantan finally looked up toward the old cowboy. "You should hate us." Silas frowned slightly without turning around. "That's so." The boy nodded. "Most white men here do." Wind drifted softly across the valley, carrying the smell of smoke and pine through the cold evening air. Somewhere down near the creek, one of the Apache horses stomped against frozen ground. Silas leaned his elbows against the porch rail. "Hate is expensive," he said quietly. "Takes too much energy to carry all the time." Nantan studied him carefully. "My grandfather says people choose hate because it is easier than understanding pain." Silas snorted softly. "Your grandfather sounds smarter than most preachers." The boy smiled faintly at that. Then his expression slowly faded again. "I did not run away because I hated my people. I know. I ran because I was scared." That answer hung heavy in the evening air. Honest fear always sounded different than cowardice. It carried shame inside it. Silas finally looked toward the boy fully now. "Scared of becoming chief?" Nantan nodded slowly. "Everyone expects strength from the bloodline." His eyes drifted toward the distant Apache campfires glowing across the ridge. "But I do not feel strong." Silas stared at the mountains for a long moment before answering. "You know what the strongest men I ever met had in common?" Nantan shook his head. "Every one of them was afraid of something." The boy frowned slightly. "That does not sound like strength." "That is because you are thinking about fear wrong." Silas rubbed one rough hand against his beard slowly. "Fear is not weakness. It is proof something matters to you." Nantan looked down at the silver necklace resting against his chest. Firelight from the distant camps flickered softly across the carved eagle. "Then why do people pretend fearless men are heroes?" Silas smiled faintly toward the darkening valley. "Because most folks have never buried enough things to know better." Silence returned again. Soft, heavy, honest. Then movement appeared down near the frozen creek below the cabin. Chief Essen was approaching alone. No guards. No weapons visible. Just the old Apache leader walking slowly through the snow beneath fading beside the porch rail. Tension crossed his face again, though not the same fear from before. This looked more like a grandson standing before someone whose approval still mattered too much. Silas remained still while the chief climbed the small hill toward the cabin. Snow crunched beneath worn moccasins. Wind lifted gray braids touched with silver beads. The old man stopped a few feet from the porch and raised calm eyes towards Silas first. "The valley thanks you for sheltering my grandson," Essen said quietly. His English carried the slow rhythm of someone who chose words carefully rather than often. Silas nodded once. Kid needed warmth. That was all. Chief Essen looked toward Nant Ann beside the porch. The boy lowered his eyes immediately. "You disappeared without telling anyone," the chief said softly. No anger. Somehow that made the words heavier. Nant Ann swallowed hard. "I know." Essen studied him quietly for several long seconds while snow drifted around them beneath the fading sky. "3 riders nearly froze searching the northern pass for you." Guilt crossed the boy's face instantly. "I did not want anyone hurt. And yet fear often hurts more people than truth." Nant Ann lowered his head further. Silence settled over the porch. Then something unexpected happened. Chief Essen stepped closer and placed one weathered hand gently against the boy's shoulder. "But you are alive," he said softly. "That matters more." Nant Ann looked up slowly, surprise flickering across his face. Silas watched the exchange carefully from the porch rail. No shouting, no punishment, no threats, just quiet disappointment wrapped inside relief. The old cowboy suddenly understood why hundreds of riders followed this man willingly through storms. Chief Essen finally turned toward Silas again. "My grandson says you lost your family to fever winters ago." Silas stiffened slightly. "Long time ago." The chief nodded once. "Loss does not measure itself by time." Wind moved softly through the valley below them. Campfires flickered against the snow-covered ridges while darkness slowly settled over Black Hollow. Then Essen looked directly at Silas with calm, ancient eyes. "You understand. Loneliness," he said quietly. "That is why the boy trusted your fire." Silas did not answer immediately, because deep down he knew the chief was right. Lonely people recognized each other the same way wolves recognize storms before they arrived. Nant Ann suddenly looked between both men. "Grandfather," he hesitated. "What happens if I still do not want to become chief?" Chief Essen turned toward the valley for a long moment before answering. "Then one day another voice will lead our people." The boy blinked in surprise. "You would allow that?" The old man looked back toward him calmly. "A title carried by fear becomes poison." Snow drifted softly across the porch steps. Somewhere below, riders moved quietly through camp preparing for another freezing night in the mountains. Then Chief Essen spoke again, though this time his voice carried something heavier beneath it. "But before you choose your future," he glanced toward the southern valley trail disappearing into darkness beyond Black Hollow. "There is something you deserve to know about why your father truly died." Nant Ann's face lost all color, and beside him, Silas Reed suddenly felt the cold mountain air cut much deeper than before. The wind grew colder after sunset, carrying the smell of pine smoke and distant snow across Black Hollow Valley, while darkness settled over the mountains like a heavy blanket. Campfires from the Apache riders flickered along the ridges in long, scattered lines, glowing orange beneath the black sky. From town, frightened families watched those lights through curtained windows and whispered stories that grew larger every hour. Some believed war was coming. Others believed the valley had already been claimed by the mountains themselves. But up on the hill beside Silas Reed's cabin, the world had narrowed to 3 figures standing beneath drifting snow. Chief Essen remained still near the porch steps after speaking about Nant Ann's father, his weathered face calm despite the weight behind his words. The boy stood frozen beside the porch rail, clutching the silver necklace against his chest hard enough to make his hands shake. Silas leaned silently against one of the wooden support posts, watching both of them carefully. "My father died during the river sickness," Nant Ann whispered finally. "That is what everyone told me." Chief Essen nodded once. "That is the story we allowed the tribe to carry." Silence. Wind hissed softly through the pine trees surrounding the cabin. Somewhere below in the valley, a horse stomped against frozen ground. Nant Ann looked up slowly, fear beginning to creep into his voice. "What does that mean?" The old chief stared toward the dark mountains for several seconds before answering. "Your father did not die from sickness." The words landed harder than gunfire ever could have. Nant Ann took one step backward automatically, confusion flooding his face. "No." Chief Essen closed his eyes briefly like a man reopening an old wound. Your father died protecting peace between our people and the settlements beyond the Western Pass. Snow drifted gently across the porch between them. Silas noticed the old man's hands now. Scarred hands. Tired hands. Hands carrying regret, too old to heal completely. There were men on both sides who wanted fear more than peace. Essen continued quietly. Your father believed the valley could survive without hatred. Some men saw that belief as weakness. Nanton stared at him without blinking. Why was I never told this? The old chief's voice lowered. Because children should not inherit the anger of old men. For a long moment nobody spoke. The fire inside the cabin crackled softly through the open doorway behind them while cold wind moved through the darkness beyond the porch. Then Nanton's breathing began to shake slightly. You lied to me my whole life. Essen accepted the words without defending himself. Yes. Why? The old chief finally looked directly at his grandson again. Because grief can either shape a man or poison him. Nanton lowered his head sharply. That was not your choice to make. Silence followed. Heavy, honest. Intentions began to rot beneath the weight of silence. Nanton stepped away from the porch rail and stared toward the valley campfires glowing beneath the mountains. Everyone knew except me. His voice sounded smaller now, younger somehow, like the burden he carried had finally become too heavy for a child pretending to stand like a man. Chief Essen moved closer carefully, but stopped before touching him again. Your father wanted peace more than revenge, the old man said softly. He died believing hatred destroys the people who carry it. Nanton shook his head slowly. And now you want me to become chief? No, Essen's voice remained calm. I want you to understand what kind of man your father truly was before you decide what kind of man you will become. Wind swept snow across the porch steps in pale, silver waves beneath moonlight. Silas watched Nanton carefully. The boy's eyes no longer carried only fear now. There was hurt there too. Hurt buried beneath years of missing answers. Did my father ever want this life? Nanton asked quietly. Did he want to lead? Chief Essen smiled faintly toward the dark mountains. Sad smile. Proud smile. Your father once told me he would rather raise horses beside a river than command warriors. The old man looked toward his grandson. But when people needed him, he stayed. Nanton's shoulders trembled slightly beneath the heavy coat. That does not sound brave. No, Essen agreed softly. It sounds tired. The answer surprised both the boy and Silas alike. The old chief lowered himself slowly onto the porch steps then, age suddenly visible in every movement. People think leadership belongs to the loudest men, he murmured while staring toward the valley below. But the mountains taught me something different. His eyes drifted toward Silas briefly. The strongest men are often the ones who wanted a quiet life and stayed anyway when others needed them. Silence settled once more. Snowflakes drifted lazily through firelight spilling from the cabin doorway. Somewhere far across the valley, wolves howled faintly against the frozen ridges. Nanton slowly sat beside his grandfather on the porch steps at last. Not close, but not distant either. Just two generations sharing the same cold silence beneath the mountains. I do not know what I want anymore, the boy admitted quietly. Chief Essen nodded once. That means you are finally asking honest questions. Silas looked away toward the dark valley beyond them. Strange thing was, he could feel something shifting tonight. Not in the mountains. In the boy. Fear had brought Nanton running into the storm days ago. But truth carried a different kind of weight. Truth forced people to stop running eventually. Then movement appeared near the lower trail below the cabin. 3 riders approached slowly through the darkness, carrying lanterns low beside their saddles. Sheriff Talbot rode in front this time, with Preacher Dawson beside him. But the 3rd rider made Silas straighten immediately. Walter grinned. The store owner's face looked pale beneath lantern light, even from a distance. That man only climbs hills at night, when trouble follows him, Silas muttered quietly. The riders stopped near the porch while cold wind moved through the valley around them. Sheriff Talbot removed his hat carefully before speaking. Silas, his voice sounded uneasy. There is somebody in town asking questions about the boy. Nanton instantly stiffened beside his grandfather. Who? The sheriff swallowed hard before answering. A railroad agent from Denver. Silence crashed across the porch like ice breaking on a frozen river. Because every person standing there understood one dangerous truth at the exact same moment. Men chasing power across the frontier rarely cared who got buried beneath the tracks. The temperature dropped hard after midnight. Frost crept across the cabin windows in twisting white patterns while the mountains around Black Hollow Valley disappeared beneath clouds thick enough to swallow moonlight whole. The Apache campfires still burned across the ridges, scattered like quiet stars in the darkness. But the valley itself had become unnaturally still. No dogs barked in town. No wagon wheels creaked. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath after Sheriff Talbert spoke the words railroad agent. Inside the cabin, silence settled heavy around the fire. While every person present understood what that name truly meant, railroads did not arrive gently. They carved through mountains, rivers, farms, graves, and treaties alike. And wherever tracks reached, men with money followed behind them, carrying maps that rarely included the people already living there. Walter Grin paced near the stove with both hands trembling against his coat sleeves. "I told him nothing," he muttered quickly. "I swear it." Chief Essen sat motionless beside the porch doorway, his weathered eyes fixed on the flames. Nantan remained beside him, clutching the silver necklace beneath his shirt now, like something suddenly dangerous to display openly. Silas Reed leaned against the wall near the window, studying Sheriff Talbert carefully. "Start from the beginning." The sheriff removed his gloves slowly, warming pale fingers near the fire before speaking. Man arrived around sundown riding with 2 hired guards and a wagon full of supplies. He glanced toward Nantan briefly. Said he was searching for a missing Apache boy tied to negotiations near the northern passes. Chief Essen finally lifted his eyes. "What was his name?" "Edwin Mercer." The old chief's face changed almost invisibly after hearing it. Silas noticed immediately. "You know him?" Essen nodded once. "Mercer buys land for railroad companies." Walter spat toward the floorboards. "Buys. That is one word for it." The sheriff continued carefully. "He claims the government plans to build new tracks through the Western Valley before spring thaw." Silence deepened, because everybody in the room knew what lay beyond those western passes. Apache hunting grounds, water routes, sacred burial hills older than Black Hollow itself. Nantan looked toward his grandfather slowly. "That is why Father was trying to make peace with the settlements." Essen nodded once. He believed cooperation might protect the valley before railroad men arrived. Fire cracked sharply in the stove. Shadows moved across the cabin walls while snow drifted softly outside beneath the dark mountains. Silas folded his arms across his chest. "So Mercer is hunting the boy because bloodlines matter in negotiations." Chief Essen finished quietly. "A frightened child is easier to shape than an old chief." Nantan's face tightened instantly. "I am not a bargaining tool." "No," Essen agreed calmly. "You are a future man with power wish to control before you understand your own worth." The words hung in the air heavily. Silas looked toward the boy beside the fire. Suddenly Nantan running away made far more sense than before. Fear had not driven him into the storm alone. Pressure had. Expectations. Politics. Adults building futures on the shoulders of somebody still young enough to fear the dark. Outside, hoofbeats suddenly echoed faintly through the snow below the cabin. Everyone stiffened instantly. Sheriff Talbert moved toward the window, first, while Silas quietly reached for the rifle resting beside the doorway. 3 riders approached slowly through the darkness, carrying lanterns low beside their saddles. White men. Expensive coats. Expensive horses. 1 wagon following behind them. "Mercer," Walter whispered nervously. The railroad agent stopped near the frozen creek below the hill and looked up toward the cabin through drifting snow. Even from a distance, something about him unsettled Silas immediately. Not because he looked dangerous. Men like Mercer rarely did. They dressed clean, spoke softly, smiled often, but their eyes measured everything around them the way butchers measured cattle. The Apache riders along the ridges had already noticed the newcomers. Torches flickered to life across the mountains one by one until dozens of silent figures watched the creek below from the darkness above. Edwin Mercer glanced toward those ridges briefly, then calmly removed his gloves before stepping down from the wagon. "That man has no survival instinct," Walter muttered under his breath. Chief Essen rose slowly to his feet beside the doorway. "No," the old chief said quietly. "Men protected by powerful friends often confuse arrogance with courage." Mercer approached the frozen creek alone beneath falling snow. stopping exactly where Chief Essen had stopped earlier that morning, respecting boundaries, or pretending to. Chief Essen, he called upward politely. His voice carried smoothly through the cold valley air. I apologize for arriving at such an unfortunate hour. No answer came from the porch. Mercer smiled faintly anyway. I believe we both understand why I am here. Chief Essen stepped outside into the snow at last, fur cloak moving softly behind him in the wind. The Apache riders on the ridges remained completely silent above the valley. You traveled far during dangerous weather, Essen said calmly. Mercer spread his hand slightly. Progress rarely waits for sunshine. Silas hated the man instantly after hearing that sentence. Nantan remained hidden inside the doorway, watching silently beside the old cowboy. Mercer continued speaking while snow drifted around him beneath lantern light. The Railroad Council wishes to avoid conflict in these territories. Walter nearly laughed out loud hearing that lie. Mercer ignored him completely. There are opportunities ahead for cooperation. Trade routes, protected settlements, shared prosperity. Chief Essen stared at him without expression. You speak like a man selling medicine from a wagon. Mercer smiled politely. Sometimes medicine saves lives, and sometimes it poisons slowly. Silence stretched between them. The valley itself seemed to lean closer, listening. Then Mercer's eyes shifted briefly toward the cabin doorway where Nantan stood partially hidden behind shadows. Just one glance. But Silas caught it. Measured glance. Calculating glance. The railroad man already understood exactly who the boy was. The future arrives whether men welcome it or not, Mercer said softly. The wise choose where they stand before it does. Chief Essen stepped forward slightly. Not threatening. Just enough to remind the valley that old mountains still carried weight. And some futures, the chief replied quietly, should never be built on frightened children. The wind swept sharply across the frozen creek then, scattering snow between both men, while torchlights flickered along the ridges above like silent witnesses. And standing inside the cabin doorway beside Nantan, Silas Reed suddenly realized Black Hollow Valley had become something far more dangerous than a frontier town caught between two worlds. It had become a crossroads where powerful men intended to decide who deserved to keep their home. Snow began falling again before dawn, soft at first, then thicker as cold wind rolled through Black Hollow Valley from the northern peaks. The Apache campfires along the ridges dimmed beneath the storm, while horses stood with lowered heads against the weather. Below the hills, the town remained trapped inside uneasy silence. Doors stayed barred. Lamps burned through the night behind covered windows. Nobody trusted sleep anymore. Not while railroad men and mountain riders stood facing one another across the frozen creek, like two futures refusing to share the same ground. Inside Silas Reed's cabin, the fire had burned low to glowing coals. Sheriff Talbert slept upright in a chair near the wall with his hat resting across his chest. Walter Grin snored softly beneath blankets near the stove after too much whiskey finally defeated his nerves. But Silas remained awake beside the window staring toward the darkness outside while snow gathered along the porch railings. Nantan sat nearby wrapped in the blue wool coat again, watching the old cowboy quietly. You have not slept since I arrived, the boy whispered. Silas shrugged faintly. Old habits. Nantan studied him for a moment. Or old ghosts. The old cowboy almost smiled at that. Almost. Outside, torchlight flickered faintly through the storm where Apache riders still guarded the ridges through the freezing night without complaint. Your people are patient, Silas muttered quietly. They learn patience because winter does not care about pride. Nantan looked toward the mountains beyond the window. Grandfather says the land always wins arguments in the end. Silas nodded slowly. Smart man. The cabin fell silent again except for the soft crackling of coals and wind brushing against the roof overhead. Then Nantan spoke without looking at him. Do you think my father was brave? The question caught Silas off guard. He leaned back slightly in the chair and considered it carefully before answering. I think men willing to carry peace into angry places usually are. Nantan lowered his eyes toward the silver necklace hanging against his chest. But peace did not save him. Silence settled heavily between them after those words. The old cowboy stared into the dying fire. No, he admitted quietly. Sometimes doing right only leaves scars behind. The boy's face tightened slightly. Then why keep trying? Silas looked toward the storm outside. Snow drifted endlessly through darkness across the valley floor. Because once enough people stop trying, he paused softly. The world gets meaner than it already is. Nanton absorbed that answer in silence. Then hoofbeats echoed suddenly outside the cabin through the snow. Fast. Urgent. Silas stood immediately, rifle already in hand before the second knock hit the door. Chief Essen entered first when Silas opened it, snow covering his fur cloak and gray braids. Chayton followed close behind with tension sharp across his face. Something had changed. Silas saw it instantly. What happened? The old chief stepped inside slowly while cold wind rushed through the doorway behind him. A rider from the Southern Trail arrived at our camp an hour ago. Chayton shut the door hard against the storm. Mercer lied. Sheriff Talbot woke instantly at the sound of raised voices, while Walter nearly rolled off the blankets beside the stove. What now? Walter muttered groggily. Chief Essen looked directly toward Nantan before speaking again. The Railroad Council is not coming in spring. The old man's eyes hardened faintly. They are already moving. Silence crashed through the cabin. Nanton stood slowly beside the fireplace. Moving where? Chayton answered this time. Toward the Western Valley Pass. Sheriff Talbot frowned heavily. That route cuts straight through Apache territory. And through Black Hollow, Silas added quietly. Chief Essen nodded once. Mercer came here to keep us distracted, while survey crews crossed the mountains unnoticed. Walter's face drained pale. Those fools are crossing winter passes? Not fools, Essen replied calmly. Men protected by money. Snow hammered harder against the cabin roof, while the fire snapped sharply in the stove. Outside, Apache riders began moving through the darkness beyond the windows. Torches shifted. Horses stirred. The camp itself seemed to awaken all at once beneath the storm. Nanton looked toward his grandfather with growing fear. If the survey crews reached the sacred valley, Chief Essen finished quietly. The peace your father died protecting disappears forever. The boy's breathing grew shallow. Silas could almost see the weight of the moment settling onto his shoulders in real time. Childhood slipping away inch by inch beneath responsibility. Sheriff Talbot stood and adjusted his coat nervously. Maybe Mercer does not know what those passes mean. Chayton gave him a long look. Men who buy mountains always learn what is buried inside them. Walter grabbed the whiskey bottle again with shaking hands. Dear Lord. Then another sound drifted faintly through the storm outside. Not horses this time. Bells. Metallic. Rhythmic. Wagon bells. Everyone froze. Chayton moved toward the window immediately. More lights appeared far down the southern trail beyond town. Lanterns swaying through snowfall. Multiple wagons. Dozens of them. Silas narrowed his eyes toward the darkness. Survey crews. Chief Essen stepped toward the doorway again, while snow whipped across the porch outside. Mercer was buying time tonight. Nanton looked between the adults around him, fear and understanding colliding inside his eyes now. If those men reached the pass, the old chief turned toward his grandson slowly. Then the valley changes forever. Silence followed, heavy enough to crush breath from the room. Outside, hundreds of Apache riders began mounting horses across the ridge lines beneath the storm, while wagon lanterns crept steadily closer from the southern trail below. Two worlds moving toward the same frozen valley from opposite directions. And standing there beside the dying fire, Nanton finally understood something his grandfather had known all along. The mountains had never been asking whether he wanted to become a leader. They were asking whether he would stand still while others decided the fate of his people for him. Before sunrise, the valley began to move. Snow swirled through Black Hollow like pale smoke while lanterns drifted across the darkness below. The ridges. Apache riders mounted horses beside fading campfires. Townsfolk stepped quietly onto frozen porches wrapped in blankets and heavy coats, staring toward the southern trail where the survey wagons crept closer through the storm. Nobody spoke loudly anymore. Fear had worn itself thin during the long night and left something else behind. Waiting. Silas Reed stood outside his cabin, pulling leather gloves tight across weathered hands while cold wind swept through the hills around him. The old cowboy had not carried a rifle across his back in years. But this morning felt different. Not dangerous in the ordinary way. Larger than that. Like the mountains themselves were holding their breath to see what kind of men would step forward once daylight arrived. Beside him, Nantan adjusted the blue wool coat against his shoulders and stared toward the Southern Valley Trail. His face still carried traces of fear, but something stronger had settled beneath it now. Understanding. Chief Essen emerged from the darkness beside the cabin leading a black horse through fresh snow. The old Apache leader looked exhausted beneath the storm, yet his eyes remained steady as stone. Chayton and several riders followed behind him in silence. The survey crews will reach the lower pass within the hour, Chayton said quietly. Sheriff Talbot stepped down from the porch, rubbing frost from his beard. If townsfolk see hundreds of riders moving toward the pass, panic will spread. Walter Grin snorted nervously beside him. Panic already spread yesterday. But Chief Essen shook his head once. Fear spreads faster when men misunderstand what they are seeing. The old chief looked toward Silas then. That is why we need witnesses. Silas frowned slightly. Meaning the valley must see Apache riders protecting this land, not fighting for it. Silence settled briefly while snow drifted between them. Then Nanton spoke quietly for the first time since dawn. I will go. Every eye turned toward him instantly. The boy stood straighter now despite the freezing wind pressing against his coat. Chief Essen studied his grandson carefully. You are not ready to carry this burden alone. Maybe not. Nanton swallowed hard before continuing. But father believed peace mattered more than fear. The silver necklace rested against his chest beneath the coat, while morning light slowly crept across the snowy hills around them. If I hide while others decide what happens to our valley, he shook his head slowly. Then I become exactly the kind of leader I feared. Silence followed. Honest silence. Silas watched the boy carefully and suddenly saw traces of another man standing there. The father he never met. A quiet strength shaped by uncertainty instead of pride. Chief Essen stepped closer slowly until he stood directly before his grandson beneath the falling snow. Leadership is not the absence of fear, the old chief said softly. It is choosing what matters more. Nana nodded once. I know. And for the first time since arriving at Black Hollow, the old Apache leader smiled fully. Not proudly, not triumphantly, just sadly, like a grandfather watching a child step toward adulthood sooner than he deserved. Down in town, wagon bells echoed faintly through the valley as the railroad survey crews approached the lower crossing. Smoke rose from their lanterns beneath the storm while horses struggled through deep snowdrifts. Silas narrowed his eyes toward them. At least 12 men, maybe more behind the supply wagons. Edwin Mercer rode near the front wrapped in a thick fur coat with his head lowered against the weather. The old cowboy could already feel tension building across the valley around them. Apache riders lined the ridges above. Railroad men entered from below. And trapped between both sides sat a frightened frontier town, one misunderstanding away from disaster. We stop this before somebody makes a stupid decision, Silas muttered. Sheriff Talbot looked toward him carefully. How? The old cowboy stared toward the valley trail. By getting there first. An hour later, Black Hollow watched something no one expected to see. Apache riders descended from the ridges in complete silence beside townsfolk riding borrowed horses through fresh snow. Sheriff Talbot rode near Chayton. Preacher Dawson rode wrapped in blankets beside older Apache elders, carrying no weapons at all. And at the center of them all rode Nantan beside Chief Essen beneath the pale winter sky. People stepped onto porches as the strange procession crossed the valley floor together. White ranchers, Apache riders, old enemies moving side by side through falling snow without shouting or threats. Children stared wide-eyed from cabin windows while mothers held them close against the cold glass. Walter Grin rode near the back beside Silas Reed, still looking uncomfortable with every mile. Never thought I would live long enough to see this, Walter muttered quietly. Silas kept his eyes ahead. Most folks do not see strange things because fear keeps them indoors. The survey wagons finally stopped near the lower pass once Mercer spotted the riders approaching together through the storm. Confusion crossed the railroad agent's face immediately. He expected division, panic, maybe even conflict, not unity. Nantan guided his horse forward slowly until he stood before the wagons beside his grandfather. Snow drifted softly between both groups while the mountains loomed silent around them. Edwin Mercer removed his gloves calmly before speaking. I see the valley has chosen negotiation after all. But Nantan spoke before Chief Essen could answer. No, the railroad agent blinked slightly. The boy sat taller in the saddle despite the wind whipping against his coat. The valley chose to stand together. Silence crashed across the snowy pass. Even the horses seemed to still themselves listening. Mercer's eyes narrowed faintly toward the child. "And who exactly are you?" Nantan touched the silver necklace beneath his coat before answering. "Someone whose father died trying to protect peace here." Wind swept across the pass, carrying snow between Apache riders and townsfolk alike. Then Silas noticed something remarkable happen around him. Men who had spent years distrusting one another were now standing shoulder to shoulder without realizing it. Sheriff beside Apache scout. Ranch hand beside tribal elder. Fear had finally met something stronger. Shared home. Chief Essen slowly guided his horse beside Nantan and looked toward Mercer calmly. "These mountains are not empty land waiting to be purchased," the old chief said softly. "They already belong to people who chose to care for them." Edwin Mercer stared at the gathering before him in silence. And for the first time since arriving in Black Hollow Valley, the railroad man looked uncertain. The snowstorm weakened near noon, and pale sunlight finally broke through the heavy clouds above the western pass. Ice glittered across the mountainsides like shattered glass, while cold wind rolled through the valley carrying the smell of pine, leather, and horse sweat. The railroad wagons stood motionless near the narrow crossing where the valley opened toward the sacred northern hills. Survey workers sat stiffly in their saddles, watching the strange gathering before them with uncertain eyes. They had expected frightened townsfolk and hostile Apache riders. Instead, they found something far more difficult to understand. Unity. Edwin Mercer remained near the front wagon with one gloved hand resting calmly against the saddle horn, though the confidence in his face had faded since Nantan spoke. The railroad agent studied the people standing together before him like a man suddenly realizing the map in his pocket no longer matched the land beneath his boots. Sheriff Talbot guided his horse forward slightly beside Chief Essen while snow drifted softly across the frozen pass. "Nobody here wants trouble," the sheriff said firmly. "Then perhaps your people should lower their rifles," Mercer replied smoothly. Silas Reed glanced around the valley. The strange thing was, most rifles already pointed toward the ground. Apache riders held theirs low. Townsfolk kept nervous hands away from holsters. Nobody wanted to be the first fool to turn fear into tragedy. Mercer saw that too, which was why his smile returned slowly. "This railroad will bring jobs, protection, trade, and growth," he continued calmly. "You are asking an entire region to remain trapped in the past." Chief Essen looked toward the mountains towering above the pass. "Some places survive because the past is remembered." Mercer shook his head faintly. "History does not stop progress." Then Nantan spoke again. "Neither does greed." Silence settled instantly. Wind swept through the pass, stirring coats and horse reins while the boy sat straight-backed beside his grandfather beneath the pale winter sun. Mercer looked directly at him now, not dismissively, carefully. "You speak boldly for someone so young." Nantan's fingers tightened briefly around the silver necklace beneath his coat. "My father died trying to stop men from dividing this valley." The railroad agent sighed quietly like a teacher dealing with stubborn children. "Your father was standing against inevitability." "No," Nantan answered softly. "He was standing for people." Those words moved through the gathering like a sudden shift in weather. Silas noticed it immediately. Ranchers exchanging glances with Apache riders. Nervous men slowly lowering shoulders they had carried tense for days. Because somewhere during this long frozen standoff, the valley had begun seeing itself differently. Not as separate sides trapped together by geography, but as neighbors sharing the same mountains. Mercer recognized the change too. That was what truly unsettled him. "You speak about unity," he said calmly. "Yet this valley survives through isolation. Roads will come eventually whether you welcome them or not." Chief Essen nodded once. "Roads are not the problem." The old chief's eyes hardened faintly beneath the winter light. "Men who arrive believing every untouched thing belongs to them are the problem." The wind quieted. Even the horses seemed to listen. Mercer's jaw tightened almost invisibly. "Careful, Chief." "No," Essen replied softly. "Careful men are why valleys disappear." Silence stretched across the frozen pass, long enough for snow to gather along wagon wheels and saddle blankets. Then something unexpected happened. Preacher Dawson slowly guided his old horse forward from the townsfolk line until he stopped beside Chief Essen. The elderly preacher removed his gloves carefully before speaking into the cold mountain air. I buried Silas Reed's wife 12 winters ago. His voice carried rough honesty shaped by age and grief. I buried Apache children during the famine winter too. He looked toward Mercer directly. The mountains do not separate suffering by skin color. Nobody interrupted him. This valley survived because people here learned how to endure storms together. The preacher glanced toward the survey wagons behind Mercer. If your railroad arrives by breaking trust first, then it brings nothing worth building. Sheriff Talbot slowly nodded beside him. Then Walter Grin surprised everyone by speaking next. I spent years blaming Apache riders for every hard season this town suffered. Walter swallowed hard against the cold. Truth is, fear made easier company than understanding. Snow drifted softly around the gathering, while Mercer's expression grew tighter with every passing moment. One by one, the valley itself was slipping beyond his control. Then Silas Reed finally guided his horse forward beside Nantan. The old cowboy looked toward the railroad agent with tired gray eyes. You want tracks through these mountains? Mercer nodded carefully. Eventually, yes. Silas pointed toward the ridges surrounding the pass. Then learn something first. Wind moved gently through the valley below them. A man can force his way through mountains once. The old cowboy paused softly. But if he wants to stay here, he better understand the people already listening to the wind before he arrived. Silence followed. Deep silence. The kind that changes rooms. Or valleys. Mercer looked around slowly then. At Apache riders sitting calmly beside ranchers. At frightened townsfolk no longer backing away from the old chief. At a lonely cowboy standing beside a boy the entire frontier expected to become something important one day. And for the first time since entering Black Hollow Valley, Edwin Mercer understood something impossible to buy with railroad money. These people had already chosen one another. The railroad agent finally exhaled through his nose and glanced toward the survey crews waiting behind him. This pass is too unstable for winter crossings anyway, he muttered quietly. Nobody celebrated. Nobody mocked him. Chief Essen simply nodded once. Respectfully, like a man accepting wisdom instead of surrender. Mercer studied the old Apache leader for several long seconds before speaking one final time. You protected this valley well. Chief Essen looked toward Nantan beside him. No, the old man's voice softened slightly. The valley protected itself once people stopped fearing each other. Snow continued falling lightly as Mercer turned his horse around at last. One by one the survey wagons slowly followed him back down the southern trail beneath the pale winter sky. The mountains remained silent watching them leave. And standing there in the frozen pass beside Apache riders and frontier townsfolk alike, Silas Reed realized something rare had happened in Black Hollow Valley. Nobody had won. Nobody had lost. But somehow, hatred had failed. Winter loosened slowly over Black Hollow Valley during the weeks that followed. Snow melted from the lower trails first, turning frozen roads into rivers of mud beneath pale, morning sunlight. The mountains remained capped in white above the valley, quiet and watchful as always. But something had changed among the people living beneath them. Doors no longer closed so quickly when Apache riders crossed near town. Ranchers tipped hats instead of reaching for rifles. Children stopped whispering fearful stories whenever they saw feathers moving through the hills. None of it happened fast. Trust never did. But little by little, the valley began learning how to breathe without fear pressing against its throat. Silas Reed noticed the changes most during mornings. He would sit outside the cabin beside a tin cup of coffee, watching smoke rise through the cold air, while horses grazed peacefully near the creek below. Sometimes Apache riders passed carrying supplies toward the northern camps. Sometimes townsfolk stopped by the cabin bringing flour, tools, or simply conversation the old cowboy had not heard in years. Loneliness still lived inside him. Some wounds stayed forever, but it no longer echoed as loudly through the silence. One morning near early spring, Sheriff Talbot rode up the hill smiling beneath his gray beard. Town council finally fixed the church roof, he announced proudly while climbing down from his horse. Silas raised one eyebrow. Miracles do happen. The sheriff laughed softly before glancing toward the valley below. Truth is, folks have been helping each other more since the storm. He hesitated. Apache riders included. Silas looked toward the distant ridges where several mounted figures moved through melting snow beneath the morning sun. Funny what happens once people stop expecting the worst from each other. The sheriff nodded quietly. Wish we learned it sooner. Down near the creek, laughter echoed suddenly across the valley floor. Silas looked over the porch rail and saw Nantan racing horses with several ranch boys through the muddy fields, while Chayton shouted warnings nobody listened to. The old cowboy smiled faintly watching them. The boy looked different now, stronger somehow. Not because fear had disappeared from him, because he had finally stopped running from it. Chief Essen arrived later that afternoon riding alone beneath soft spring light. The old Apache leader dismounted near the porch and stood quietly beside Silas for several minutes watching the valley below before speaking. The mountains are waking again. Snowmelt trickled through the hills around them, while distant birds drifted above pine trees for the first time since winter began. Silas nodded once. Looks that way. Essen studied the ranches scattered across Black Hollow carefully. Your people repaired 3 Apache cabins after the storm. Your people repaired my barn roof. The old chief smiled faintly. Perhaps balance still exists in this world. Silence settled comfortably between both men. Not awkward anymore. Shared silence. The kind earned through surviving difficult winters together. Then Essen looked toward Nantan in the distance. The boy had stopped racing now and stood beside the creek talking with the other children beneath the sunlight. He has decided to return north with us after the thaw, the chief said softly. Silas nodded slowly, though something tightened quietly inside his chest hearing it. Figured he would. Essen glanced sideways toward him. The boy speaks of you often. Silas snorted lightly. Hopefully not all good things. Mostly stories about coffee terrible enough to wake the dead. The old cowboy laughed quietly at that. Real. Laugh. Rare sound. Wind moved softly through the valley, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine around them. He still fears becoming chief, Essen admitted after a while. Good. Silas replied immediately. The old chief raised one eyebrow slightly. Silas rested both arms against the porch rail while staring toward the mountains. Men who want power too badly usually should not have it. Essen considered those words carefully before nodding once. Your wife must have been patient with you. The old cowboy looked toward the faded blue shawl hanging inside the cabin doorway behind them. She was smarter than me too. The chief smiled quietly toward the valley. That helps marriages survive. Evening arrived slowly over Black Hollow as golden sunlight spilled across melting snow and distant ridges. Townsfolk gathered near the church that night for the first spring supper since the storm. Apache elders sat beside ranch families sharing food beneath lantern light, while fiddles played softly inside the old hall. Nobody announced peace. Nobody signed treaties. Life simply continued differently than before. Sometimes that was enough. Near sunset, Nantan climbed the hill toward Silas's cabin, carrying something wrapped carefully beneath his arm. The boy stopped near the porch steps and held it out quietly. It was the blue wool coat Silas had given him during the storm. Clean now. Folded neatly. You should keep it, Silas said. Nantan shook his head. No, he smiled faintly. I think it belongs here. The old cowboy accepted the coat slowly while the boy reached beneath his shirt and removed the silver necklace for the first time since arriving at the cabin weeks earlier. The eagle carving gleamed softly beneath the fading sunlight. My grandfather says leaders carry reminders, Nantan said quietly. Things that teach them who they are supposed to become. Silas frowned slightly. Sounds heavy. Maybe. The boy looked toward the valley below where Apache riders and townsfolk laughed together near the church lanterns. But I think I finally understand my father now. Wind moved gently through the mountains around them. Then Nantan carefully placed the silver necklace into Silas Reed's weathered hands. The old cowboy stared down at it in complete silence. Kid. Nantan smiled softly before stepping backward toward the trail. You kept me warm when nobody else knew who I was. His voice lowered slightly. That matters to my people. Silas looked up slowly, but the boy had already turned toward the valley below where Chief Essen waited beside his horse beneath the fading spring sky. The old chief met Silas's eyes one final time across the distance and placed one hand over his heart without speaking a word. Then grandfather and grandson rode north together toward the mountains while evening settled gently over Black Hollow Valley. And long after the sound of hoofbeats disappeared into the hills, Silas Reed remained standing alone on the porch with the silver necklace resting in his hands and something unfamiliar warming the quiet places inside his chest. Out in the Old West, Justice did not always arrive with gunfire or blood or vengeance. Sometimes it arrived slowly, like snow melting beneath the first spring sun. Sometimes it looked like strangers choosing trust over fear. And sometimes, if a man was lucky enough to live long enough to see it, kindness found its way back home.